Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with a long overdue installment of 70 Years of Moving Mud, a history of iron bombing podcast. This is episode 22, Weasels Gone Wild. As I said, this episode is long overdue, and I do apologize. The reasons for this are many and manifold, ranging from the pressures of real life and business travel to some health issues, and, honestly, some other competing projects that just get in the way. I mean, originally I had been waiting a little for the arrival of Hitler's F4E because our story arc is getting pretty close to converging with the operational history of the F4 and even the F4E, and I was hoping to be able to connect the dots between the historical reality and the model of the aircraft in DCS, before we get too much farther down the line and had to go back and cover the same ground again. But first of all, the F4 was delayed a little, and then after it debuted, I hadn't allowed for the fact that it was going to generate a fair bit of work for me generating content about it. So, at any rate, I do apologize for the delay, and I'll certainly try to be better now about producing these episodes on a more regular basis. So, since it's been a while, let's talk about where we are and where we might be going in terms of the podcast. At this point in the podcast, we have spent a lot of time working our way up to talking about the war in Vietnam. Now, largely, that's because the Vietnam War really was, well, let's call it an inflection point in the history of air power, and specifically the use of air power to attack targets on the ground. It was really the first example of modern air combat, where a modern air force had to contend with a fully modern, integrated air defense network that included not only interceptor aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery, but also multiple forms of electronic warfare sensors, including early warning and targeting and tracking radars and missiles, both air-to-air and surface-to-air, that featured full terminal guidance with radar. From the other side, so to speak, it also saw the advent of the very first precision guided air-to-ground munitions instead of pure iron bombs and rockets. So over the course of, let's say, 6 or 7 years of the air war in Vietnam, the whole appreciation of the air war underwent really a tectonic shift, not only because it was the first deployment in anger of some of those important technologies, but also because Vietnam, in an odd way, really spurred a changing of the guard, particularly in the United States Air Force. You can see this during the later part of the war. In the early 70s, there was a real exodus of tactical air command fighter pilots because, honestly, a lot of guys who'd done a tour in Vietnam really didn't want to do another one. This, plus the massive growth of the civil airline industry at the same time, made a career in the Air Force a lot less attractive than it might have been for, say, the previous couple of decades. In addition, the United States Air Force implemented a policy that no pilot had to fly 2 tours in Vietnam until all pilots had flown at least one. And I don't mean TAC pilots, I mean all pilots. So by the late war, most of the experienced tactical Air Force pilots had done their tour. The pilots that were coming into the theater were either brand new or coming from assignments and aircraft where they had no experience at all in air-to-ground or even in air-to-air combat. So the end of the war saw an awful lot of pilots coming into the theater who really had no experience of any other kind of air war. They had not really even started training until after the Vietnam War had been going on for some time, which meant that the tactics, techniques, and procedures had already started to shift by the time they entered training, sometimes pretty dramatically. In other words, by the end of the Vietnam War, there were a lot of pilots flying fighters for whom the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were practiced in Vietnam seemed, well, normal. And because many of those were younger, of the younger generation, they were also a bit more comfortable with some of the underlying basic technology, like screens and buttons instead of knobs and switches. I think this was the start of a very important transition, the transition from an aircraft being a weapon that the pilot wielded to being a platform that carried the weapons that the pilot would employ. using the information that the sensors on board the platform collected, and which the computers on board the platform integrated and then displayed to him. Understanding that shift is really going to be important in trying to come to grips with the way aircraft and airpower doctrine and tactics developed in the decade from, say, 1970 to 1980. And so we're going to talk about that a lot in future episodes. For now, though, let's talk about the first fighter aircraft that really embodied this new approach, this new focus on the aircraft as an integrated weapons system. Which means, yes, dear listener, it is finally time to talk about the Wild Weasel. So in order to do that, let's pick up the narrative again in the summer of 1965, when the Air Force was confronting the fact that the North Vietnamese air defense system included Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, and that they were a new and dangerous factor in air warfare. So not long after the SAMs made their presence felt, in that summer of 1965, the United States Air Force was already beginning to develop tools and tactics that allowed it to start to contain the threat posed by those surface-to-air missiles. The first thing that pilots learned was that the SA-2 was large and, yeah, pretty scary, but it was not fast, and it was not maneuverable, and it left a very significant signature smoke trail behind it when it launched. Thus, if it could be spotted, it could be defeated by some hard maneuvering that placed the target aircraft effectively inside its effective turn radius. This was really just a matter of timing, and again, if the missile was seen at a reasonable distance, it was quite possible to pull it off. But the problem that was affecting the evasive maneuvers usually meant jettisoning ordnance. And since it was not always clear which aircraft was the target of the SAM, that meant that every SAM launch might cause several aircraft to jettison their ordnance. So even though crews were having some success staying alive in a SAM-denied environment, they were having a lot less success accomplishing their missions in that environment. Something more than keen vision and the ability to fly aggressively was clearly needed. What was needed was effective ways of fighting SAMs where they actually lived, which was the electronic spectrum. Because after all, a SAM really is a weapon that relies on electronics, specifically radio frequency electronics. The rocket engine and the payload are useless without the ability to detect, track, and close with a target, a fast-moving, distant, and potentially elusive target. Defeating a SAM was really about defeating its radar at the end of the day. And that could only be done on the electronic warfare battlefield. Now, this was not a battlefield on which fighter pilots of the time were trained to fight. Now, remember, on the day of the first SAM engagement, the United States Air Force had no fighter-class aircraft that carried any kind of electronic warfare gear whatsoever. They didn't even field a radar warning receiver on fighter aircraft at the time. Fighter pilots and their commanders had basically been raised to believe that fighting in the electronic spectrum was something that other people did, not fighter pilots. But it was in the electronic spectrum that SAMs were most vulnerable, so that is where the fight needed to move. Now, the first weapon that the Air Force rolled out in the electronic warfare domain was defensive in nature. It was the jamming pod. This was basically a unit which was carried on a weapons pylon of a strike aircraft, and which broadcast a powerful signal on the same wavelength as the tracking radar of the SA-2. This meant that the tracking radar was unable to establish a range to the target carrying the jammer, which meant that it couldn't lock on, which meant that it couldn't launch or guide a missile to that target. Now, jammers were only partially effective. Eventually, the strength of the actual tracking radar return signal would become strong enough that the jamming could be rejected as noise, and the target could in fact be locked. This was known as burning through the jamming. The radars were almost always able to burn through the jamming, but they often could only do so at a significantly reduced range. This meant that each SAM battery effectively covered less airspace because their effective range circle was smaller. It also meant that the SAM operator's task became quite a bit more demanding because they had a lot less time to lock a target and fire a missile, because once the range started to increase again, the jammer would eventually swamp the radar and tracking would be lost. So the introduction of jamming pods and the collection of a bunch of electronic warfare intelligence about how the SA-2 actually operated helped planners and pilots understand how they could operate in SAM country, if not safely, at least in a way that made the threat manageable. The price, though, again, was first of all that the efficiency and efficacy of the bombing missions was, pretty seriously compromised by the tactics that were required in order to passively counter the SAM threat. To use the jammer effectively required flying in something called the pod formation, which was a tight formation, and it required flying in that formation for long periods of time, which added to pilot fatigue. It meant that pilots were more focused on getting to and from the target in the pod than they were in attacking the target effectively. Their options for attacking the target were also significantly constrained by the need to avoid being out of the pod at altitude at any time during the mission, at least for an extended period of time. The second price that was paid was really aircrew morale. By the fall of 1965, the only tactics that had been developed that were effective at all were, just what I said, passive resistance. Neither the jammers, nor the formation flying, nor the support of electronic warfare aircraft gave pilots any weapons with which to hit back at the threat that was killing their colleagues. This is not a world in which anyone wants to live, but it was a world in which is really toxic to the fighter pilot. What pilots wanted was a way to attack the threat, but to do that, they needed an aircraft that was specifically designed for that task. Or rather, they needed an aircraft whose systems were designed for that task. These aircraft would adopt the call sign Wild Weasel, and that moniker would eventually become the label for this class of aircraft. Over the years, there have been several versions of Wild Weasels. The first incarnation was a modification of the F-100 Super Sabre. The initial Wild Weasel aircraft were adaptations of existing airframes, and so they started with the F-100 because there were a lot of them hanging around without much of a job to do. So, F-100Fs, the two-seat models, were fitted with jamming pods and radar homing and warning receivers so that they could identify where to look for SAMs. Now, this gear was not very sophisticated. It didn't provide any indication of where the SAM was, only the direction in which to find it. And the early gear also did not provide any indication of the status of the radar or of a missile launch. Basically, it just told pilots in what direction to look for the smoke trail. The initial batch of Weasel aircraft also did not carry any weapons specifically designed to defeat SAMs. The radar homing missiles would come later. The first Weasels were essentially there to be the hunters, or maybe it's more appropriate to call them the trackers. They would be accompanied by the killers, which were thuds armed with standard iron bombs. The idea was that the Weasels would identify where to look for the SAMs. If the SAM battery then launched on them, they could, armed with the foreknowledge of where to look, evade the launch while closing rapidly on the SAM site. Combined with active jamming, this meant that they would hope to get within the minimum engagement range of the SAM battery before that battery could fire any more than one or maybe two missiles. After that, having locked down the location, they would mark it with white phosphorus rockets, and the accompanying killers, who would have been able to spot the smoke trails anyways, now could also see the smoke marks, and they would move in and bomb the site directly. It wasn't a mission for the faint of heart. Effectively, the job of the Wild Weasels was to make themselves targets so they could better target the enemy. This required flying directly into the teeth of the enemy air defenses. A common saying amongst Wild Weasel crews, encapsulating the peril of their missions, was first in, last out. This highlighted their role in entering hostile airspace ahead of strike packages and lingering in the threat environment to ensure the safety of the main force. So, as I said, the first Wild Weasel was an F-100F, a two-seater 2 seats were required because the AN-ALQ-31 radar homing and warning receiver required a dedicated electronic warfare officer, or EWO, to operate it. Even though this equipment appears pretty rudimentary by today's standards, it truly was, at the time, a black box that fighter pilots of the day wanted no part of. The 9 Weasel aircraft and their crews arrived in theater on the 25th of November, 1965, and immediately set to work. They very quickly demonstrated the validity of the Weasel concept. They also demonstrated daily their courage and commitment to taking the fight to their adversaries, who definitely felt the effect. SAM losses mounted, and SAM batteries had to adjust their tactics to be on the lookout for the Weasels. This, in turn, compromised their efficiency because tracking and engaging Wild Weasels prevented them from doing their real job, which was to reduce the effectiveness of the strike aircraft. Despite this early impact, though, it rapidly became apparent that the F-100F wasn't a good choice for the role of Wild Weasel. First of all, it was too slow. When loaded with drop tanks, an F-100, even armed only with rockets, just couldn't keep up with even fully loaded thuds, which made coordinating between the hunters and the killers kind of difficult. Not only that, but the F-100 was not a very maneuverable jet. I mean, it was the first true supersonic jet, which meant that it really had no features that addressed the emerging problem of how to build a plane that could travel very fast in a straight line and still be able to turn corners effectively at slow speed. But to avoid and evade, SAMs that had been launched in their direction required aggressive maneuvering, which was really at the very edge of the F-100's capabilities, honestly, which was to say the least suboptimal. Within 6 months of going into action, the first Wild Weasel detachment had to be withdrawn. A third of the planes had been lost along with their crews, and the remainder were damaged beyond repair, either by overstressing their airframes or because of battle damage. But the concept of suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, SEAD, or SEAD, depending on who you're talking to, had been proven. But a new design was needed. Now, luckily, again, the Air Force was actually moving with some urgency to solve that riddle, and the next version of the Wild Weasel was based on the F-105D model, which was the 2-seat version of the F-105. But this was followed fairly quickly by the G model, which featured improved and integrated EW equipment, which was more effective and less of a performance hit because it didn't need to be carried externally on the weapon station it was built into the airframe. The Air Force also worked out a deal with the Navy to start using their anti-radiation missile, the AGM-45 Strike, while the Navy was also developing an improved model. The Strike was a missile that was based on the AIM-7 Sparrow, but the radar seeker head had been replaced by a seeker that just homed on radar emissions. Now, the Shrike was a good first step in the battle against electronic opponents because it was specifically designed to lock on that radar signal, and the radar signal of the SA-2 Fansong radar, and then it flew directly at it, exploding on impact. The existence of the missile initially posed, I think, a little bit of a rude shock to the SAM operators, as their primary offensive weapon, their radar, suddenly became their greatest vulnerability. But it was not long before the North Vietnamese SAM operators adapted. The Shrike, again, was a good first attempt to prove the principle of the utility of the anti-radiation missile, but it did have some serious limitations that the SAM operators soon began to exploit. The first issue was that the Shrike had no ability to coast through a period of signal loss. As soon as it lost the radar signal it was homing on, it would lose track. And then it could not reacquire the target, so effectively it became useless at that point. So, if a radar operator could tell that a Shrike was in the air, shutting down their emitter and restarting it would cause the missile to simply lose lock. Now, this sounds simple. It's often presented as a very smart thing that the North Vietnamese figured out. But, it wasn't actually all that easy to implement. First of all, the operators needed to be sure that there was a missile on the way, which was not at all obvious. Plus, every time they decided to cycle their emitter, they lost precious seconds. Sometimes, many precious seconds, because, turning off that radar, turning it back on again in that unit, not just as simple as flipping a switch. While those seconds were ticking away, they were losing their awareness of where their potential targets were and what they were doing and how to prioritize them. So the tactic was effective at preventing a strike, but it once again degraded the efficiency of the SAMs doing their primary job. The second limitation of the Shrike was that it was quite short-ranged, much shorter range than a guideline missile, which meant that in order to launch a Shrike attack, the Weasel had to fly into the SAM's engagement zone and stay focused on the target rather than evading incoming SAMs for long enough to launch an effective strike. It basically turned the whole process into a high-stakes game of chicken that required both nerve and luck on both sides. The final issue with the Shrike was that it had a very small warhead, so small that when it collided with a radar antenna, often the damage was limited to even the antenna itself. The explosion was often not large enough to do permanent damage to the actual radar unit, and it certainly didn't pose much of a danger to the radar operators in the radar van or vehicle. Thus, even a successful Shrike attack would really only take out a SAM site. It would only take them out of the fight for really maybe a few hours, because once the North Vietnamese became adept at knowing what spares to stock and how to replace the damaged parts quickly, the radar could be brought out back online, with some alacrity. So these limitations of the Shrike were identified early on. Actually, they were known about really before it even went into general use. And so there was a new anti-radiation missile that was already in work. This was based on an existing missile, but this time it was the Navy's RIM-66 Standard missile, which was a surface-to-air missile, and it was much larger and much faster than the Shrike. This meant that it could be launched from much farther away, and it also meant that it arrived much sooner than the Shrike, meaning that the SAM operators had much less time to decide whether or not to play electronic hide-and-seek with it. Now, the so-called STARM also had the advantage that it was faster traveling downhill than an SA-2 was traveling uphill, meaning that if a pilot was quick and fired a return shot at a SAM site quickly enough, the STARM would arrive at its target before the SA-2 achieved conjunction with the plane that had launched it. And while the STARM was fire and forget, so long as the radar operated, the SA-2 required active guidance from that same radar. So in order to defeat an incoming STARM, the SAM crew would have to write off the missiles they already had in the air. And if they did not avoid the strike, the STARM's large warhead, it was likely to ruin several people's day and possibly eliminate the SAM battery, or at least the SAM's radar section, permanently. So, once again, it raised the stakes in that game of chicken. The advantage wasn't decisive, but it meant that the North Vietnamese integrated air defense system needed to spend even more time trying to avoid being killed, so they had less time to actually prevent strike bombers from reaching and bombing their targets. And this was why the Weasel mission became known, and still is, as SEAD, Suppression of Air Defense, because ultimately it was not about destroying SAM sites. It was about suppressing them until they were not a threat, at least not as much of a threat to the main mission of the Air Force, which was getting bombs on targets. So, the cat and mouse between the Weasel pilots and the SAM operators continued throughout the air war in Vietnam. Each side learned about the other, and each side continually evolved tactics, techniques, and procedures to try to get ahead. The tactics employed by the Wild Weasel missions continually evolved in response to the changing dynamics of the battlefield. Initially the focus was on just direct suppression of SAM sites to safeguard accompanying strike packages, but as the North Vietnamese adapted by using decoys and mobility to preserve their SAM assets, the Wild Weasels expanded their roles to include pre-strike suppression, escort duties during major bombing missions, and post-strike protection of withdrawing aircraft, so there might be waves of Weasels in any given mission. Unfortunately, in this constant game of cat and mouse, the North Vietnamese ended up with one really significant advantage, and that was the experience of their personnel. Unlike Air Force pilots who only served one tour in theater, North Vietnamese SAM crews were there for life, whether that life was short or long. The process of Darwinian selection through combat tended to mean that the best SAM operators were the ones that survived, and they rapidly became much harder to fool and much harder to hit. And it also has to be said that beyond the physical destruction of enemy assets, though, the Wild Weasel missions did perform a crucial psychological role by instilling a sense of vulnerability within the North Vietnamese air defense crews. It essentially leveled the playing field between those crews and the pilots. The presence of the Wild Weasels made the operation of SAM sites perilous and stressful, as the hunter could quickly become the hunted. The Wild Weasels also crucially validated the idea that the EW arena wasn't just a slideshow. In fact, it was really the arena in which future wars could well be won or lost, although it would still take the Air Force in the U.S. and other air forces a while to fully come to grips with this reality, sometimes with serious and negative consequences. By the end of the Vietnam conflict, the stage had been set, and more importantly, the personnel had been trained who would take the Air Force into this next arena and, effectively, into the next millennium. Anyways, I think that's going to do it for this episode. Next time, I think we'll switch gears a little bit and go for a cruise, by which I mean I think it's time to start talking about the Navy's air war in Vietnam, and maybe take a look at how it was a little different than the Air Force. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.